Okay. All right, so we at the Disability Cultural Center are super excited for this event. It's one of the regular events we have in partnership with Bodies of Work and the 3 Arts Fellowship here at UIC. And as we transition to our event, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that our center and the Department of Disability and Human Development at UIC inhabit spaces that are built on the occupied original homeland of the Council of 3 Fires. That's the Ojibwe, O-J-I-B-W-E, Potawatomi, P-O-T-A-W-A-T-O-M-I, and Ottawa Nation, O-D-A-W-A, and other nations such as the Menominee, M-E-N-O-M-I-N-E-E, Ho-Chunk, H-O-C-H-U-N-K, Miami, and many other Indigenous peoples. We honor Native people in our community and the many Native people who continue to call this land home. Disability justice must include dismantling settler colonialism, white supremacy, and ableism. And just a note of connection, Alter Narrative, which this event is part of, is a series that's invested in telling how and talking about how storytelling and other forms of art-based exploration can undertake this work, often by telling stories that are otherwise erased. Okay, so again, thank you for being here today for our panel, and the title of the panel is On the Stage in the Archive, a conversation with 2020 UIC 3 Arts Fellows, Brian Balcom and Tsehaye, Geralyn, Hébert. Okay, without further ado, I want to thank our moderator, Bianca Frazer, and hand it over to her.
This is Bianca speaking. Thank you so much, Margaret. So my name is Bianca Frazer. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white cisgender woman with a round face, wearing glasses, a dark gray shirt and black blazer with brown hair up in a ponytail. There's a white wall behind me. So I received my PhD in theater from the University of Colorado Boulder, where I was studying how diabetes was represented in drama. I'm now a postdoc at UIC in the Disability and Human Development Department, where I am further researching representations of diabetes. So it is my great pleasure to be with you all today and to guide this conversation with 2 incredible, accomplished theater artists about their work and their time with the UIC 3 Arts Fellowship, which is a program designed to foster artists' relationship with disability art and culture. So I'll get us started by giving each of our artists a chance to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what kind of work you do. Brian, how about we start with you?
How about we start with me? My name is Brian Balcom. I am a Asian male in my late 30s. I have very short black hair. I am wearing a black collared shirt, and behind me is, I guess, sort of an abandoned office of sorts. I am, and I do use a wheelchair, but that is not seen in the frame of the video. I am a freelance director in Chicago, and I also work as the access coordinator for Victory Gardens Theater, where I ensure that all of our performances have access services and as enhanced access services as possible. And I also run some programming for artists as well, for artists with disabilities.
Thank you, Brian. We'll pass it over to Tsehaye. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what kind of work you do?
You're muted.
Unmuted. I'd be happy to, Bianca, and I would be honored if you play some of the slides while I am talking over them, the first couple. First of all, I wanted to honor my ancestors. I would like to honor my mother, who would not let me whine when I complained that there weren't any roles for a Black girl like me. And she just had no patience. She just said, write your own plays, and turned and walked out of the room. And that meant that I was to go and write my own plays. And there are lots of people to thank on this journey. And when I do have a platform, I try to thank them. And they are the many people who have upheld me over the last couple of years. My work is reflective of Sankofa. So as I move forward, I am constantly trying to pull from the past, the gold from the past. If you will run the next two slides. I am a Black woman, mixed heritage. My family is from Louisiana. They are from Maroon communities. While we honor our tribal elders, we don't always know who they are and what specific tribes they come from. But from our understanding, the pictures that you're being shown are pictures of my ancestors, and they are hailing from Africa, from Europe, from Louisiana by way of Native nations, the Houma Nation, Natchez Nation, the Tunica Biloxi Band, Choctaw, Estruma, Chitimacha, Cushata, the Jenna Band of Choctaw Indians, and the Tunica Biloxi again. Next slide, please.
Sorry to interrupt. This is Margaret. You have some wonderful images on your slides. Are they 19th century photographs of your family?
They are actually 19th century photographs of my family, and my family has always kept very strong records. So I am honored to share these photos with you. Because my family kept these pictures, we are able to go back and honor our ancestors. And they have been vibrantly and vigorously doing this. And I share that because part of the grounding that I stand on is having a couple hundred years of history from the late 1700s until now. That has been an unbroken lineage of literacy, of record keeping, of documentation. That is a profound gift. So as I introduce myself to you, I really am introducing you to my ancestors, because these are the shoulders upon which I stand. I am in my study, and I have a white wall behind me. I have a lot of gray hair that's piled up, and there's a band around it. And I am wearing the color red, and I'm facing a lot of sunshine. I think we have one more slide, and I think that's the end of the introduction, please. Right, and I think it's so important, as difficult as it is to witness and to share the history, especially the history that we have shared this summer, to understand that some of us really speak at great peril, and that our lives have been totally conscripted by censorship. And, you know, from native tongues on to what we can and cannot say. And we have paid dearly for speaking out. So it is an honor for us to be able to speak now.
Well, I'm honored to have you both with us today. So can we learn a little bit more about each of your story? How did you come to work in professional theater?
I'll go first. So I actually started theater when I was by way of choir. Actually, I was in a children's choir when I was very, very young. I think ages like 3 till 7, and the director of that children's choir was also the children's director at the Ordway Theater in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm from Minnesota. And she invited me to audition for South Pacific, and that was being produced over there. And I auditioned, and I got the role, and I went up on stage, and I sang Dites-moi, and I looked out over, you know, the sea of hundreds and hundreds of faces looking up and smiling at me, and I felt great. I mean, I think anyone in theater really started doing theater and started performing, you know, in front of their families in their living rooms because they craved attention, like, and we all still do, I think. So that was how it all started. And through that choir director, I appeared in a couple operas with the Minnesota Opera Company, and started doing theater in grade school and junior high. And I was injured. I was injured in a bicycle accident when I was 13 years old. I was riding my bicycle across the bridge and I fell off, crushed the T4 vertebrae in my spine. And I kept doing theater after that in school and into high school, actually. But when I was in high school in the early 90s, I looked around and I realized that there weren't going to be any roles that were written for people who looked like me. You know, the roles that did exist at the time were the after school special kind of roles. And the one that sticks out in my mind was on Saved by the Bell, where Zach Morris met a girl at a swimming pool and they were swimming. I think they ran into each other in the lanes in the pool, and they got to talking and they asked her out, and he asked her to the whatever diner that they normally go to, and she showed up in a wheelchair. And then the music played and cut to commercial, and how was he going to deal with this? Anyone that I saw on TV at that time with a disability was there to serve the purpose of creating empathy and for the main character to grow and learn and be a better person. And that's not the kind of role that I wanted. And conversely, at the time, nobody was going to say cast Hamlet as with a disabled actor. That just wasn't back then something that was even considered or heard of or happening in any way, shape, or form. So I knew that if I wanted to keep doing theater, I needed to find another outlet. And so I started directing one acts in high school. I started assistant directing in high school, and I went to a pre-college program at Carnegie Mellon University and as an actor, but there were a couple of directing electives that I could take, and I got hooked. I realized that this was a great way for me to continue on in theater while not having to deal with the obstacles and issues being a disabled actor back in the mid to late 90s. So so I actually went to Carnegie Mellon for my full undergraduate program. It was the only program in the country at the time that had a 4-year directing curriculum. A lot of the other schools had directing degrees, but you took like 2 years of studies with the actors, and then maybe if you still wanted to be a director, you could take 2 years of directing classes, or they were built into like a theater studies major, and you graduated with a theater studies degree and not a directing degree. But I knew that directing was absolutely what I wanted to do. So I was lucky enough to be admitted into that program. I moved back to Minneapolis after I graduated. I started a very small company dedicated to commissioning and producing new plays. And in Minneapolis, we have the Playwright Center, which is a well-respected, well-known organization dedicated to fostering playwrights and voices and new plays and new play development. So there were a lot of playwrights around the area that were coming in for fellowships, and that sort of stuck around in Minneapolis because it was a very livable and arts-focused area. And after a while, I started to, after about 7 years out of undergrad, 6 or 7 years out of undergrad, I really understood what I did well as a director, as an artist, but I also started to understand what I did not do well, and my shortcomings as an artist and a director, either working with scripts or working with actors. And I started thinking about graduate school as a way to become much more well-rounded. I didn't want to look at a script and say no to it because I was afraid of it, or because I didn't know how to start or where to begin, or this is in a artistic language that is unfamiliar to me. I didn't want to shy away from any work, any projects, because I felt inadequate or unequipped for any reason. So I started applying to graduate schools, and I applied to graduate schools for a few years. I think 3 years I applied, and you learn a lot when you're applying for grad school. And one of the things I learned was I wanted to attend school in the city that I wanted to work in. I didn't want to go to, Iowa City or to New Haven and then immediately leave when I graduated. And that sort of narrowed my applications to Chicago, Northwestern, and DePaul. And I came here to go to graduate school at DePaul. That took 3 years of my life. It was a complicated relationship with grad school, but it has made me a better artist and a better director. And I graduated in 2016. I've been working freelance since then. And oh yeah, I started working at Victory Gardens as an intern. We needed an internship to fulfill some requirements in school, and I started working with the Access Project and with Mike Irvin and Monte Cole, and then Laura Baker as the leaders of that program. And then I assumed the role of Access Coordinator a year and a half ago, and it's been a really interesting journey as far as sort of what I'm able to get done and the kinds of change I can affect in an admin role at Victory Gardens as well. So that sort of brings us up to speed as to how I got where we are right now.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, Brian, for sharing that piece of your story. And Tsehaye, I'll pose the same question to you. How did you come to work in professional theater?
Well, my story is not unlike Brian's. I come from a family of creatives. My mother was trained as a classical musician. Everybody in the family played music. Both my grandfathers played violin, fiddle to you all, if you're from Louisiana. They played Creole fiddle. And I grew up, in the land of Mardi Gras. So with everything being dramatic and everything being over the top, everything was spectacle. And my dad ran a movie theater and also that doubled at night as one of the Chitlin circuit spots. So James Brown would come and play. Jimi Hendrix played in Baton Rouge one time. So there's just this sleepy little town, and there's just all this kind of crazy stuff that's going on, but good mix of stuff. There's Cajun music over here, there's Zydeco over here. You could hear like a brass band in the middle of the day just marching through the streets because, and so I kind of grew up thinking that this is how the world was, and really began to rapidly understand it was not. So I think some of the more dramatic moments, I'm always trying to frame, if I'm not trying to frame them in the rectangle of my dad's movie theater, I'm sitting at somebody's back porch or kitchen, and I was just that kid that just nagged everybody. Just tell me a story. Where did you come from? What's your name? And I walked around with my little Nancy Drew tablet. I was just like insufferable, and that's how I started getting these pictures from my ancestors that, people would say, oh, come here, let me show you this. But my mom was a first grade teacher as well, and she was in charge of all of the pageants and all of the musicals. So I got roped in to play every role in everything when I was the extra kid, and I hated it. But I had to do it because I was not musical and I didn't want to play piano, so I had to do something. And I didn't live in New Orleans where my other family lived, where they owned dancing schools and everybody took ballet and tap dance, but I had to stay in Baton Rouge and just, listen to stories. So long story short, like Brian, I was always in somebody's play, and then I started doing acting gigs for college students who were getting their MFAs and needed to have kid actors. So I started doing that, and played everything from the Mock Turtle and Alice in Wonderland to Shakespeare to just, the whole canon of Black work. And I dropped out of school. I hated it. When I got to college, I was always casted as this, light-skinned Black woman with this long hair and stuff. And I was like, oh my God, this is just like boring. So I went to New York and I studied with Barbara Antier at National Black Theater. I was there during this golden age when like the producer Oba Babatunde and I used to share a bag of French fries because we couldn't afford 2 bags of French fries. And I studied dance and I went to plays and I just, you know, it was just improbable. I was 19 years old and was about to be engaged to be married to a very wealthy man. And I said, oh my God, when I was told I couldn't be in theater, I bolted. So that's how I ended up in New York. Came here to go to Northwestern, and that's been the springboard as well. And just started doing small things. At my kids' school, I did ASL, Black folk tales. I would volunteer to, you know, be a part of anything that was storytelling. So I spend most of my time now writing and not on stage, although I eventually venture on stage at some point, but it's my favorite place is behind a pen.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing about your story. I was hearing themes of the love of performing arts and those places where something's not working, not fitting yet. So the next question I have is about your experience in the 3 Arts Fellowship. You're both here with us today as a part of your 3 Arts residency at UIC, which again is a program aimed at deepening artists' relationship with disability, art, and culture. So can you share with us a bit about what has your relationship been to disability, art, and culture? Have you always been interested in disability representation or disability arts? And lastly, how have you been able to develop that interest at the residency so far? And Brian, we'll go to you first.
Okay. So wait, the 3 questions were?
Okay. So what has your relationship been with disability, art, and culture?
Oh,
Is
yes.
it something?
Let's
okay.
pause there. Okay. So you know, I for a long time, I tried to be as, I'll just say it straightly, I tried to be as non-disabled as possible. You know, when you're going through rehabilitation, the goal is to become as independent as possible, right? To be able to navigate the world as if, you know, to cope with your disability as, you know, and make it a non-obstacle, really. And to try to find a way to be completely independent, to live on your own, to find ways to interact with people and the world around you without any sort of barrier or hindrance or anything like that. So for a long time, I tried to be as not disabled as I could. And that included not really taking part in a lot of disabled community conversations or events or things like that. I was, you know, going it alone because I could, because my injury sort of allowed me to navigate pretty freely. You know, I didn't have a lot of daily care needs. I didn't have a lot of medical needs. I was able to move through the world pretty normally, so to speak. As far as how, you know, it wasn't until I started working at Victory Gardens where, you know, I started to realize my, the only way I can think of phrasing it is ability privilege, really. That my disability, I'm extremely lucky and extremely privileged that my injury isn't as, there's no other word, I can't even think of a better word to say it, but isn't as restrictive or debilitating or as confining as maybe some people with the same exact injury as mine. So, you know, I really started to understand that just because I am lucky and I am fortunate doesn't mean that I shouldn't work to help others experience life in the same way, experience art in the same way, and experience theater in the same way. And so that was sort of the start of my champion for access for all, both in access services for arts, you know, things like captioning and the ASL interpretation and services for blind and low vision, patrons, but also oh yeah, so that was sort of how I started focusing more on that. As far as my own personal art, I never really thought that my personal artistic missions were disability driven until maybe a couple months ago, where I started to, you know, when you're pitching shows as a director, you sort of have to pitch yourself as well. And I through several meetings and encounters, I sort of honed the script to describe what I like to do and the stories that I'm attracted to. And those are things like underdog stories. Those are things like stories about underrepresented groups and people who are fighting to be seen, and stories where the protagonist doesn't always win, and what kind of conversations those create. And it wasn't until a couple months ago where I realized that, you know, my disability and the way I see the world has shaped the kind of art that I search for, the kind of art that I like to create, the kind of stories that I gravitate to. All those themes, there's no way those themes aren't related to my disability and how I navigate the world. It's just part of who I am. And you know, it all makes complete sense now that, you know, you put A and B together and, hey, look at that. Yeah, so the next question in that series of questions is?
Yes, it was a tangle of questions. So how has your relationship to disability art and culture changed during this residency?
Yeah, it's, I think our relation to art has everyone's relation to art has changed during this. You know, so I directed a show at Theater Wit called Teenage Dick that opened a day before Chicago got shut down. And we were fortunate enough to have video cameras there. We recorded it. We played it on, you know, we had a run online. And it sort of put into perspective, we're getting some, okay, there we go. We had some TV background noise from someone going on. I was going to say that, you know, it really put into perspective the amount of, oh, what am I trying to say here? The access that we all needed once everything got shut down is similar to the access that some of us need on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And that sort of realization of arts organizations and individuals around the world, the ability to work from home, the ability to call into meetings, the ability to or just experience art in the way, in the time, in the that you need, I think is really important. And I hope that is something that carries through once this is all over, to make arts accessible, you know, not just for people who are in the same city as you are, but also around the world. We had people tuning in from, you know, Kansas, from Australia, who wouldn't have normally been able to see the show. So that's something that changed because of what's been going on recently.
Excellent. So Tsehaye, I'll ask the same question of you, what your relationship to disability art and culture has been and how it's changed over the course of your residency so far.
Well, I will tell you, I became disabled in graduate school in my final year. And the experience of dealing with the disability, of having been in rehab for a year, having used a wheelchair for that year, then a walker and a cane, and also during the year I was hospitalized, I had a tracheotomy, so I could not talk, and I was also paralyzed. So I came back from, you know, this this massive illness. And it's very important to, I think, not to be nitty gritty, but to also be granular in that my disability is an acquired disability. It's not a disability I was born with. So my experience is different in many ways. My experience is an experience of loss and regaining. That's not everybody's experience. But it wasn't until I became disabled and began to understand how much was taken away from me. I went through a period of profound grief because I worked on the ADA policy at my organization. And we should have been farther along. Somebody else should have done that. And I was just overcome with, wait a minute, that was my job. I made sure we had parking spaces. I made sure we had ramps. I made sure we had la-di-da-di. But it is the attitudinal changes that I think are sometimes most persistent. And in the process of watching how friends and colleagues, people I'd known for 30 and 40 years treated me differently, I was like dumbfounded. So I do what I do best. I recorded everything that I could because I thought it was so interesting and fascinating. So I became an anthropologist on Mars, and I just documented everything. I mean, I have hours and hours of video because I could not believe that in 1 minute I was Tsehaye, and then the next minute I was something and somebody else. Then it was all mediated by my body. And I thought that was just like the strangest, queerest thing in the other sense of the word that I'd ever imagined, because I was still that same person. And it affected like notions of beauty and how people move in the world. And I became invisible. And it's like everything that happened, it was so familiar to me because it felt like I was going back to apartheid and Jim Crow, because that's what it felt like when I could not get into a building. It felt like there was a huge whites only sign or colored entrance over here. So that became like this really radical frame for me. But to back it up, not until I became disabled and joined ADA 25 Advancing Leadership, and later the Chicago Cultural Accessibilities Consortium, did I have an outlet for some of that anger and that activism. And it was important for me. There are disabled people in my family. There have always been disabled people in my family. My kid is managing a disability. She has multiple sclerosis. My aunt had Down syndrome. My great aunt. I never knew a world that wasn't a part of disability. And it wasn't until I became, disabled that I lived across the street from the School for the Blind. I grew up seeing blind and low vision people every day. So they really were not aberrations to me. That was just my world. And 2 blocks away was the State School for the Deaf. So my entire world was full of people who signed and who walked with canes, and I never, that's the population in my neighborhood. So when people were asking me, well, what's your disability consciousness? I was like, well, I don't know. And I woke up one day and said, wait a minute, I was living a disability world. And both of those schools were whites only because it was during apartheid era, Louisiana, right, during the 50s. But interestingly enough, my godmother is an RN, and she was the nurse at the Black School for the Deaf. So I used to bug her so much, she would take me along with her, and I was trying to read Braille, and as a kid, I was trying to figure out how people communicated. My best friends, I dated this guy, later found out they were at the same school because their parents were professors. They taught themselves how to type using a Braille typewriter. That's the kind of nerdy stuff we did because we were in the environment. So I think later when my family members became deaf, and before they actually became deaf, I was like all into this love of sign language because I was a dancer, and I was into the beauty of it and not the utilitarian nature of it. And my brother said to me one day, you don't want to learn how to sign. And I was like, what are you talking about? He said, well, if you wanted to learn how to sign, you would at least know the alphabet by now. And he had taught himself to sign because he fell in love with a girl who was deaf. So he was trying to impress this girl. What's up, you know? So the next time I saw him, I had my alphabet down and he was like, now go and learn some phrases, you know. That's how competitive we are. So that kind of kicked me off. And I just kept doing more and more things. And just, you know, I taught my children sign when they were learning how to speak. So it was just something that was part of my world. But the residency has been really incredible because it has given me a body of work to read, a block of time to read it, and to integrate the awareness around racism, the intersection of racism, disability, gender issues. It's been incredible, and especially to be in an arena where I can talk to Brian, a director, I can talk to Carrie with her, you know, consciousness and her academic research, and you and all of you all, you know, focused on like one or two problems, one or two challenges. And my theory is that as I am making work, I have to totally think about my cast, my stage, my everything. And if I truly am an inclusive playwright, I can write for anybody or anything. So I learned through the process of winning the Candida when I went to Atlanta and mounted something that had integrated sign language, that my job is not to figure it all out. My job is not to answer questions. My job is to ask questions. My job is to problematize as a writer. And, you know, as John Lewis say, make good trouble and then hand it over to the tech people and say, have fun with that. Hey, I want 5 light changes in like 4 seconds. Do it. I don't know how you do that. I'm not a lighting designer. And I love these people, and tech loves me, and I'm having so much fun right now. And lastly, I want to say I'm combining studies of creative placemaking, and it is fascinating to have this externalized world, right? To be thinking about the built environment at the same time I'm constructing my own work, and also intersecting with the center and all that's happening in Chicago right now with development. So it's the craziest bit of gumbo. I don't know which way I'm going some days, but I know that it's a bit of creative chaos. And out of that, we're going to have some good policy past COVID. I totally agree with you, Brian. We can't do this. We can't do that. We can't meet with people. It's inaccessible. And overnight, it just switched. So I think it's the will. You have to have the political will. You have to have the passion for what you're doing. And you really have to be ready to change on the dime if you believe in what you're doing. If not, then you're not on my team, because I can't go halfway. We're too far. 30 years into ADA, we should have livable cities. There should not be one complaint in this city about somebody not being able to get into a public facility like we have over the past couple of years, just getting on the bus and the train sometimes. So let me get off the soapbox right now. But how can Brian come and work in my theater if he can't get into the light booth? If you can't get into the rehearsal room, you know, we're doing it bass backwards is what we're doing. So why not just do it right from the start?
That's an excellent question, and such a good word from both you and Brian. So we are at about 3:45. So I think it's a good time to turn towards our audience and open up the chat for questions or responses. And so for anyone who wants to ask a question, one way you can do this is to turn on your microphone and ask your question. And if you could say your name, for example, this is Bianca and my question is, so that's one way you can ask a question. Or you can put your question or your response to the talk so far today in the chat, and then I will read that out for the group. So give folks a minute. If you have any questions for Brian and Tsehaye and what they've shared so far today.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. My name is Danielle Cartagenis. I am a undergraduate student at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And this has just been such a super interesting talk. I do not have any disabilities, but I am a woman of color. And it is just so, like, I just really enjoyed hearing from both of the speakers today about how like obvious it should be to like give accessibility. And agreed, like once COVID came and suddenly it's like, oh, everyone can work from home and do classes online, and I'm like, why hasn't this been available from the beginning? And it's just like, it's such an obvious thing to just have these things be available and accessible to everyone. It's not that hard of a concept. And it's been really, really fascinating hearing both of your guys' perspectives. So thank you so much for sharing and for allowing me to participate today.
One interesting thing that I've heard is that corporates, there's talk amongst, well, I can't remember. I've heard that corporations are considering limiting the amount of time that employees are in the office now and sort of forcing a work from home situation because they're realizing they don't have to pay as much in office space. They don't have to pay as much to heat the office space, to clean the office space, to sort of maintain offices where people gather. So hopefully this opens things up for people with disabilities who have difficulty traveling or difficulty with an office environment to be able to work from home and earn a living in ways that they weren't able to do before.
Hi, my name is Cindy Lutenbacher. I use she, her. I'd like to ask first Tsehaye and then Brian about some of the obstacles that you have faced in your plays. I don't mean the writer's block obstacle, but in terms of getting your work mounted and how those obstacles were overcome.
I think the way that I most frequently encounter that is in space limitations and am I going to be able to get into the rehearsal space of that theater? Am I going to be able to get into the performance space of that theater? There was there's a theater in town that I admire, and I've had a couple meetings with their artistic director, and we talk about plays, we talk about what we like, just get to know you meetings. And it wasn't until the second meeting where I realized I can't get into their rehearsal space. It's up on the second floor and there's no elevator. And so in order for me to work at that theater, they would need to somehow rent or find another rehearsal space with added cost to them of potentially several thousands of dollars. So I think the difficulty as a director in getting the plays that I want produced really come down, as far as accessibility goes, really comes down to, can I work in their space? So that's where I encounter it most. And I have to be, it's a question of do I want to keep fostering relationships with theaters in the hopes that one day they'll either have the money or come up with the money to find an accessible rehearsal space, or if some other creative solution comes our way so that we can work together. But that's how I most frequently experience accessibility issues to getting my work presented. And I don't have a good answer for that, other than just finding money somewhere or finding creative ways to navigate spaces.
I think I want to jump in here. I know I'm not going to jump the gun with Brian, but Brian is doing some research that completely connects with my lived experience. The year that I won the Candida, I was the first Black woman to have won it, the first person with a disability to have won it. And the first person who had her AARP card and her graduate school card at the same time. So I kind of broke a couple of barriers. And I think that sometimes when people hear the story, I'm not sure they know what to expect when they hear your writing or they see your writing. You might write something completely outside of a disability experience. You might write something from completely inside. But I think some of the barriers, to be quite honest, are can be biases against older writers about writers who do have disabilities. As Brian said, when you get into the building, you must have something else happening. I write plays with characters who have different abilities. They're differently abled. I know some groups don't like that word, but some people do like it. So I'm trying to use the language carefully, right? But again, if they can't get into the building, I can't hire those people. If there's a sound designer who is blind and low vision, I need for him to talk with my set designer who might be deaf, my stage manager. How do all of these people communicate? And I don't think that's an untoward question to ask, because when people come to audition, I have to be ready in that room to be able to communicate with everybody, right? How do I do that? So it really makes us think about a theater that is completely reflective of the society that we live in, right? How do we do that? Well, I think it starts with people sitting at the table or coming together to really craft performances from conception on up. In Atlanta, for example, Cindy, who without fair and disclosure is a dear friend and colleague and one of my co-madres and writers. If I'm working with people who are deaf, I don't need a sign language interpreter a week before the play. I need the signers in the room through table readings, through the beginning. And when we were able to have that, we had such a rich performance, it was mind-blowing. And everybody in that room learned sign language, not just by osmosis, but each one of us had either taken a class or done something. And one actor learned sign language just to audition. She wanted the role so bad. She lit the place on fire. So that kind of change, when it happens, has this ripple effect. But you want to be able, when people do come back into the theater, in a post-COVID theater, I've got other things to think about. I'm a Black woman. I'm a brown woman. I'm bringing brown and Black people into the theater. I got to make sure they get into the doors without being shot, darn it. They can't go to Bible class without being shot. We can't go to get a bag of Skittles without being shot. So when I'm thinking about theater and I'm thinking about accessibility, and what if you build a new theater, you have to think about just so many things. What does accessibility mean for somebody who, is using a chair, somebody who is blind, and I got to get them out that building? Where's the, you just have to look at so much stuff. That's not a problem for me. That's a brilliant challenge. What if, with all the best minds thinking about how to build something spectacular, what if we did that? So I'm in the what if stage, Dr. Lutenbacher, but I would agree with Brian. I need money to hire those interpreters. They cost. There are few theaters Black theaters that have the financial wherewithal. Once you're in an equity, you're doing, another level of work, you can do a lot of work, but you want to see your career flourish. You want to see it move. You want to see it grow. And on that level, I've given my play, any theater company that's deaf in this country or in the world can have my play for free. I have said that because you got to be a disruptor. And if the licensing for a theater company that's deaf is problematic, that's off the table. They have it. So I think we have to continue to find some really out the box ways and some beautifully disruptive ways to move the agenda on towards full inclusivity.
I just want to note really quickly, we have tons of interesting questions coming in the chat, and some folks are messaging me privately. And one question I want to make sure we get to before we might end this event, the projects that you're working on specifically with 3 Arts. If you could describe that work for our audience.
Yeah, so I'm taking 2 different tracks. One is that I am taking this time to read a lot of plays by writers with disabilities. And I've been collecting those from a couple of different sources, but there's been a really wide range of writers with disabilities, either things disabilities they were born with, or disabilities they acquired. There were a couple of deaf writers, deaf hard of hearing writers, a couple of writers with cerebral palsy, a couple of writers with traumatic brain injuries that they've only recently sustained and survived. And some of the writers are addressing it head on in a very sort of in-your-face activism sort of way. Some of them are writing about disability in very subtle ways that you may not pick up on until after you go home and you think about it for a little while. So it's been a really interesting range of disabilities, and also ways that these playwrights are sort of addressing it in their work. And the other thing I'm doing is I'm getting ready for the next stage of my life and career in getting some mentoring about the artistic director role. It's something that's always been in the back of my head for a while, and it was always something that I thought about was something that I could do when I'm older. Well, I'm older, and that time is coming. And time might even be now, but I'm talking with a lot of artistic directors in town about their role, what they love about it, what they hate about it, talking to them about things like fundraising and relationships with their board of directors and with their managing director, and leadership styles and company management and things like that. So those are the 2 things I'm doing with my time as a fellow.
Tsehaye, we're almost at time, but could you share with us briefly your project?
I sure can. I'm working on 2 deep dives of work that I've been exploring before, and one of them is on funk music and P-Funk, and the song "Make My Funk the P-Funk, I Want to Get Funked Up," and the opening note is O, and I'm exploring the whole circle of ability, disability, how we're in the circle. It means we're all one, and then it means nothing. So I'm playing with that concept and just collecting people's recollection of funk music. And I'm also taking it to task for its ableism. The second part of the work is Preston Jackson completely changed my entire worldview when I was at School of the Art Institute. I did finish my undergrad at Northwestern. When I got to School of the Art Institute, I was immersed with all of this beautiful artwork. So I began to find a piece of art that reflects the tone of one of my works, or each character has a piece of artwork. And Preston's work really spoke to me. And we're taking his 15-foot obelisk weighing many tons, and we are replicating this in some form or fashion with projection and stretched canvas. And we are going to move this obelisk across the stage because it represents the burden of history. And if you see the obelisk, there'll be a link that you'll be able to go to and see it. It's reflecting of, there it is, this beautiful piece of work. And I was just taken by, when I was in my wheelchair, this is 15 feet tall. How could I see the top of that obelisk? So we're trying to figure out how to make that statue accessible, but I'm also using it as a political statement of the burden of history that African Americans carry, especially disabled African American bodies carry this weight, the weight of history.
Hey everyone, so this is Margaret again. This has been such a fantastic exchange. I just want to thank everyone for coming again. And I want to thank both of our artists for joining us and sharing your stories, sharing your wisdom. There's a lot more to talk about, as we can see in the chat. But I also wanted to flag, we have linked a feedback form in the chat. We would love to hear how the event was for you in terms of what you want to see more of and what we could consider changing in the future. This also helps us make a case for more of this kind of programming. So we will send that over email as well, but that's my plug, but please fill out the feedback form. And just wishing you all a really good evening. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian and Tsehaye. Thank you, Margaret.